It's certainly my pleasure today to introduce Stefan Selig, who's the Under Secretary of Commerce for International Trade at the US Department of Commerce. You have his bio in front of you, so I won't run through it in extensive detail. Mr. Selig, prior to coming to the Department of Commerce, has extensive private sector experience. He's been Executive Vice Chairman of Global Corporate and Investment Banking at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Before that, he's been Vice Chairman at Bank of America Securities and has held various other senior investment positions on Wall Street. I'll leave it at that and welcome Mr. Selig to the podium. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Ken and WITA, for the opportunity and invitation to speak with all of you today. I think Ken might have been amongst the first people I met almost 2 years ago when I came to Washington to assume this role, so I'm glad to be seeing him. Ken will remember me 2 years ago as having a big, full head of hair, so you can imagine what our trade agenda does. But seriously, let me congratulate WITA on this important series highlighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Your organization has been instrumental to what we are doing in the administration and continues to be a real driver to advance this administration's historic trade and investment agenda. I am head of the International Trade Administration. The mandate of my organization, as many of you know, is to promote international trade, attract foreign direct investment, and foster a level playing field for American businesses. And given that role, I can personally attest to the importance of WITA's partnership to help achieve this agenda, and I look forward to continuing that partnership, not just today, Ken, with you and your organization, but throughout the remainder of my tenure as Undersecretary. Perhaps before I begin, I can just take a brief moment to discuss the importance of TPP's passage in Congress. As our conversations with members of the Hill continue, we believe it will become self-evident that this agreement projects the highest standards of 21st century global commerce, and that it represents a truly historic opportunity for our firms, our workers, our economy, and our values. This is supported already by the wide range of organizations that have come out in support of TPP. That includes, amongst others, the Chamber, the BRT, NAM, the Farm Bureau, and the National Small Business Association. And I'm hopeful that this support that this agreement has already garnered will soon extend to Congress so that it can get TPP passed as quickly as possible. Josh said before I did this, I was a businessman, and I can tell you as a businessman that time is rarely one's friend in these circumstances. In fact, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, delaying implementation, even by 1 year, will cost our economy roughly $94 billion in permanent losses. The last time I was invited to speak before WITA was almost a year and a half ago. Obviously, that speaks to the quality of that presentation then, so hopefully I'll do a better job today. But what I can say, of course, is what a difference 18 months makes. I'm referring to the fact that since then we did secure passage to renew Trade Promotion Authority for the first time in 13 years, and of course just last month we signed TPP. But for all the progress we've seen over that period of time, clearly the global economy has also presented significant challenges. For one, we have seen a dramatic decrease in commodity prices, largely driven by sub-$30 a barrel oil, which has helped shave more than $15 trillion of market cap off the global market since just last year. 3 of the world's economies now are causing real concern amongst investors and economists. Brazil, with the downgrade of its debt by all 3 rating agencies to junk status, is now in a deep recession. We're seeing a substantial economic contraction in Russia due to oil prices and Ukraine-related sanctions, and which have resulted, of course, also in a plummeting ruble. And of course, volatility and uncertainty surrounding China, given recent projections of sub 7% GDP growth for the foreseeable future. Negative interest rates have also emerged as part of international monetary policy, while at the same time spurring anxieties about persistent anemic growth, as well as deflationary pressures in certain markets. And we are also seeing weakening global demand, particularly in emerging markets with declining capital inflows that have exacerbated this trend. And on top of all that, we have witnessed the emergence of protectionist policies and sentiments overseas, including in some of our closest European partners. And even unfortunate protectionist rhetoric here in the United States, with the mistaken refrain that globalization and trade is a path to American decline. I think all of this leads to a fundamental point. Whether you're an economist, an investor, a business owner, or worker, there are very real concerns today that economic growth that is robust, sustainable, and inclusive may be more elusive than it has been at any time in the recent past. With global commodity-driven expansion now coming to an end, with zero and negative interest rates leading some to believe that stimulative monetary policy has been exhausted, with rising public and private debt levels limiting the ability for governments to employ stimulative fiscal policies, and with questions regarding secular stagnation and whether there is enough investment demand to spur future growth, as well as deeper questions about whether such growth can be truly inclusive. But regardless of where you come out on these concerns, they all speak to what I believe is an undeniable economic reality, that there is no path to growth that is robust, sustainable, and inclusive that does not include increasing demand and increasing levels of productivity. And that is why I can say that this path fundamentally requires robust trade policies. And given my conviction that trade policies are one of the most potent ways to drive and harness greater demand and productivity, and in light of the very limitations on the other levers of economic growth which I just referenced, I would argue now that we are at a critical inflection point, not only to make the public case in order to secure support for this historic TPP agreement, but to help secure long-term support for a robust trade and investment agenda. In the specific area of TPP and U.S. services exports, we have a perfect example that will help us go a long way towards making the case for TPP and for that very robust trade agenda. Specifically, because we will be able to highlight the key competitive advantages that propel our global leadership in this sector, the most highly educated workforce in the world, the most productive workforce in the world, and the leading innovation ecosystem in the world that attracts 40% of global investment in venture capital and accounts for 30% of global R&D. But I would argue that just as important to this case are three critical growth narratives regarding our services exports. First is the narrative of our services exports as a long-time contributor to American job and export growth, specifically given the globalization of services over the past 20 to 25 years. That globalization of services was, of course, catalyzed by the rise of emerging markets in developing economies that substantially increased global trade and services. The explosion of global value chains that deepened reliance on export-intensive service sectors, where today roughly half of value-added inputs to exports come from services. And the profound ICT advancements that have enhanced the delivery of traditional services catalyzed the rise of digitally deliverable services and provided a new platform for SMEs to compete globally with larger firms. Because the United States was already the world's leader in services exports in the early 1990s, and because these catalysts fed into our key competitive strengths, we were uniquely situated to experience the dramatic job and export growth that came with maintaining and deepening that leadership over the past 20 plus years. During that period, U.S. services exports would more than triple and now exceed $710 billion. And it is worth noting that our services sector produces surpluses year after year after year. And because of the preeminence of our services sector relative to the rest of the world, the U.S. has been able to mitigate the adverse effects of growing headwinds in the global economy. But perhaps most importantly, between 1999 and 2014, U.S. jobs supported by services exports increased by 36%. And today, services exports account for more than 4.5 million American jobs. The second growth narrative relates to the robust, sustainable, and inclusive growth that our services exports will drive once TPP is fully enacted. TPP is a generational opportunity for our services exporters as compared to other earlier agreements, particularly the General Agreement on Trade and Services, or GATS. Because TPP utilizes a negative list approach, as opposed to GATS, which uses a positive list approach, U.S. services exporters will enjoy a superior breadth of coverage and superior quality of commitments for market access. More specifically, TPP contains several new advancements relative to GATS and our other free trade agreements, which will better combat behind-the-border regulations that impede our services exporters. Regarding TPP's investment chapter, not only will it prohibit discrimination against foreign investors, while stabilizing strong investor dispute resolution measures, it will also combat tech localization policies that force U.S. investors to use technology from a country's local firms. Through TPP's chapter on telecom, all countries have to now ensure sufficient competition in their market in order to prevent dominant, often state-owned mobile operators from denying access to a network and opening up a sector that has historically been one of the most protected in the region. Through the cross-border trade and services chapter, TPP includes very real enhancements in the area of express delivery by securing commitments to market access and to non-preferential treatment for state-owned enterprises. This is not only a win for U.S. express delivery service providers, but for all U.S. companies, big and small, that rely on express delivery. The financial services chapter will allow cross-border delivery of electronic payment card services and stronger disciplines to ensure that postal entities selling insurance products are not benefiting from preferential treatment relative to foreign competitors. Now, while I acknowledge there are concerns regarding data localization for financial services firms, I can tell you that the administration is working closely with industry and the regulators on this very issue as we speak. And with services playing such a crucial role in global supply chain, TPP brings significant advancements here as well. We all know that TPP will create a seamless region for supply chains by reducing and eliminating tariffs and by recognizing the importance of avoiding national standards and instead using international standards where they already exist. But beyond this, TPP will also ensure that products below a de minimis value will be free from tariffs, and that partner countries will make commercial rules and regulations available for public comment before they are published, and that TPP partners will criminalize bribery and develop codes of conduct for officials by joining the UN Convention Against Corruption. TPP also represents a general opportunity within the context of the digital economy, precisely because it is the first major multilateral agreement of the digital economy. TPP now positions our digital services exporters to gain market access in Asia Pacific in such sectors as network management, internet search, data analytics, and cloud computing, amongst others. And will also secure the digital capital that many, if not all, services sectors rely on by protecting cross-border data flows, preventing the imposition of customs duties on electronic transmissions, and protecting our innovators by ensuring that they do not have to transfer their technology or source codes in order to gain market access. And of course, TPP is a generational opportunity to access a $600 billion services import market from the Pacific Rim, a market that will only grow as the majority of the global middle class shifts to the Asia Pacific over the course of the next 20 years. So clearly, when it comes to economic growth for our country that is robust, sustainable, and inclusive, I do not know how you can envision any path that does not include TPP. TPP will spur robust growth by supporting our digitally intensive industries, which as a whole have already increased our real GDP by as much as $700 billion, while increasing real wages by up to 4.5% and adding 2.4 million new jobs. It will spur sustainable growth, since it will secure our economic footprint in precisely the area where much of the new global consumption and economic power will be contained in the coming years and coming decades. And it will spur inclusive growth by maximizing the returns on our export-intensive services sector, which tend to pay 18% higher wages than non-export intensive services industries do. But there is a third and final growth narrative that I would like to highlight with you this morning, and it relates to American leadership. And it brings me back to the criticism we've been hearing lately in this country on trade. I frankly find this criticism more than a bit confusing, because in the same breath that many attack trade and investment policies, they also talk about the importance of maintaining and growing American leadership. But I simply do not see how these 2 points are mutually consistent with each other. Let me here refer to the words of President Kennedy, who said, "Economic isolation and political leadership are wholly incompatible. If we are to lead, we must act." And as I said before a WITA audience 18 months ago and since, trade is not a threat to American leadership. It is, in fact, an expression of it. Trade is, of course, an expression of our commercial leadership. And TPP will allow us to grow that commercial leadership by bringing best-in-class services to millions of new consumers around the world. Trade is an expression of our governmental leadership, and TPP will allow us to grow that leadership by advancing rules of global trade that reflect our core American values. That is proven by the fact that TPP represents nothing short of the strongest commitments to labor, environmental, and intellectual property protections in history. And finally, TPP is an expression of our strategic and diplomatic leadership. If you examine every core international interest that requires American leadership today, whether that is driving global growth and opportunity to prevent the rise of violent extremism, combating climate change, reinforcing energy security, deepening our bilateral and multilateral relationships, and maintaining the rules-based order that has sustained peaceful prosperity in the world for the past 70+ years, none of these can be accomplished without a robust commitment to fair and open trade and investment from the United States. And this is precisely why TPP has been labeled the economic leg of the President's rebalanced Asia and the Pacific, because it will secure our long-term presence, deepen crucial alliances and partnerships, and help us advance the rules-based order in precisely the part of the world that is increasingly becoming the global political and economic center of gravity. So in the same way that critics have to present their vision for how we can achieve real growth without constructive trade policies, they will also have to explain how we can possibly maintain and grow American leadership without a robust trade and investment agenda. And I am confident that as this conversation continues, our case will become that much more compelling. And that is why I look forward to working with all of you to make this important case to the American people. Our services sector has been a backbone of our economy, supporting good, high-paying jobs. And in order to ensure that this will continue, we need to do everything we can to make sure TPP becomes a reality during this administration. And in making that case together, we will convince more and more Americans that trade and globalization is not a path to American decline. It is indeed a path to American prosperity and greatness. Thank you all for listening.